June 4, 1942. Dawn breaks over a tiny atoll in the central Pacific, Midway Island, 1,300 miles northwest of Pearl Harbor. Three Japanese aircraft carriers steam toward this remote outpost, their decks packed with bombers and fighters. Admiral Chuichi Nagumo, who led the devastating attack on Pearl Harbor 6 months earlier, commands the strike force. Behind him, the most powerful naval armada Japan has ever assembled spreads across hundreds of miles of ocean. Their mission: capture Midway, draw out the American fleet, and destroy it in a decisive battle that will secure Japanese dominance in the Pacific. But 200 miles northeast, three American carriers lie in wait. Against all odds, they know the Japanese are coming. They know the date, the time, even the direction of approach. The Battle of Midway would be decided not by superior numbers or firepower. Japan held both advantages, but by something invisible: intelligence. The ability to read enemy communications, to see through deception, to turn information into decisive action. This is the story of how a small group of codebreakers in a basement in Hawaii changed the course of World War II. December 7, 1941, shattered American confidence in the Pacific. In a single morning, Japan's carriers struck Pearl Harbor, sinking or damaging 8 battleships and killing over 2,400 Americans. But amid the destruction, one critical target survived: the American carriers. Enterprise, Lexington, and Saratoga were all at sea during the attack. Japan had won a tactical victory while missing the strategic prize. More significantly, another target remained untouched: a basement facility at Pearl Harbor known as Station Hypo, the Navy's signals intelligence unit for the Pacific. Station Hypo was commanded by Commander Joseph Rochefort, a brilliant cryptanalyst who worked in a windowless basement, often in a bathrobe and slippers, chain-smoking while analyzing intercepted Japanese radio traffic. His team of linguists, mathematicians, and radio operators worked around the clock, attempting to crack Japan's naval communication codes. The Japanese Navy used a cipher system designated JN-25 by American intelligence. It was a complex code that substituted 5-digit numbers for words and phrases, then added another layer of 5-digit numbers to obscure the message. Breaking it required not just mathematical skill, but linguistic intuition and exhaustive pattern analysis. By spring 1942, Rochefort's team had achieved partial breaks into JN-25. They couldn't read every message, but they could extract fragments, enough to detect patterns, identify units, and sometimes divine intentions. In April 1942, those fragments began telling a disturbing story. Japanese radio traffic was building toward something big. Messages referenced a target designated AF. The volume of communications suggested a major operation, possibly an invasion. But where was AF? Admiral Chester Nimitz, Commander-in-Chief of the Pacific Fleet, needed to know. The United States couldn't defend everywhere. With limited resources and Japan holding the initiative, American forces had to be in the right place at the right time. Rochefort believed AF was Midway. The traffic patterns, the units involved, the logistics discussions, everything pointed to the tiny atoll that represented America's westernmost outpost in the central Pacific. But belief wasn't certainty, and other intelligence analysts disagreed. Some thought AF might be the Aleutian Islands off Alaska. Others suggested it could be Hawaii itself or even the West Coast. Nimitz needed proof. Rochefort devised an elegant solution: a deception operation that would force the Japanese to reveal their target. He arranged for Midway to send an uncoded radio message reporting that their fresh water distillation plant had broken down and the garrison was experiencing water shortages. The message was deliberately sent in the clear, designed to be intercepted. Then Rochefort's team waited, listening to Japanese radio traffic. Within days, they intercepted a Japanese message reporting that AF is short of water. The trap had worked perfectly. AF was Midway. Now Rochefort's team worked frantically to extract every possible detail from the intercepted traffic. When would the attack come? What forces would Japan commit? What was their approach route? Piece by piece, they assembled the picture. The operation was scheduled for early June. Admiral Yamamoto Isoroku, commander of the combined fleet and architect of the Pearl Harbor attack, was committing virtually every major warship Japan possessed. The plan was classic Yamamoto: bold, complex, and dependent on surprise. A diversionary attack on the Aleutian Islands would draw American attention north. Meanwhile, the main striking force would approach Midway from the northwest, bomb the island into submission, then land invasion forces to capture it. When the American fleet responded, as Yamamoto was certain it would, his carriers and battleships would be waiting to destroy it in a decisive engagement. Japan would eliminate America's Pacific carrier force, secure Midway as a forward base, and potentially force the United States to negotiate a settlement. It was a brilliant plan with one fatal flaw. The Americans knew about it. Nimitz faced a critical decision. Intelligence suggested the Japanese would commit 4 or 5 carriers to the operation, possibly more. The United States had only 3 operational carriers in the Pacific: Enterprise, Hornet, and Yorktown, which had been badly damaged at the Battle of the Coral Sea in early May. By any conventional calculation, the smart move would be to avoid battle, preserve his fleet, and defend Hawaii. But Nimitz trusted Rochefort's intelligence. If the assessment was accurate, surprise would give the Americans a chance to even the odds. If they could position their carriers northeast of Midway without being detected, they might catch the Japanese at a vulnerable moment. It was an enormous gamble. If the intelligence was wrong, if this was Japanese deception, if the attack came from a different direction, if the dates were incorrect, Nimitz would be committing his entire carrier force to a potential disaster. But Nimitz made the call. All 3 carriers would deploy to a position northeast of Midway, designated Point Luck. They would wait in ambush, letting the Japanese come to them. While American intelligence worked to understand Japanese intentions, Japanese intelligence failed catastrophically to understand American capabilities. Yamamoto's plan depended on surprise, and on the assumption that American carriers would not be in the vicinity of Midway when the attack began. He believed the U.S. fleet would need several days to respond after the attack was detected, time that would allow Japanese forces to consolidate their position. This assumption rested on a critical intelligence failure. Japanese reconnaissance in the weeks before the operation was inadequate. Submarine patrols that should have detected American carrier movements were delayed and incomplete. Long-range flying boat reconnaissance from the Marshall Islands was cancelled due to the need to establish a refueling base, which American forces disrupted. Most significantly, Japanese naval intelligence had no idea that their codes were compromised. They believed JN-25 was secure. They had no indication that every radio transmission was being intercepted, analyzed, and exploited by Rochefort's team. This overconfidence extended to operational security. Japanese radio communications before the battle were extensive and relatively careless. They discussed target designations, unit assignments, logistics arrangements, and timing, all transmitted by radio because Yamamoto's forces were too dispersed for any other form of communication. Every transmission was a gift to Station Hypo. By late May, Rochefort had assembled an intelligence picture of extraordinary detail. He knew the Japanese would attack on June 4th or 5th. He knew they would approach from the northwest. He knew Admiral Nagumo would command the carrier striking force. He even had reasonable estimates of which specific carriers would participate. The intelligence wasn't perfect. Rochefort didn't know the full extent of Yamamoto's supporting forces, the battleships and cruisers positioned to the west, ready to engage once American carriers were located. But he knew enough. On May 27th, Enterprise and Hornet departed Pearl Harbor, followed the next day by Yorktown, which had been repaired in an incredible 48-hour effort that should have taken months. Rear Admiral Frank Jack Fletcher commanded the American force from Yorktown, with Rear Admiral Raymond Spruance commanding Enterprise and Hornet. By June 3rd, all three American carriers were on station at Point Luck, approximately 200 miles northeast of Midway. Japanese reconnaissance had failed to detect them. As far as Yamamoto knew, the American carriers were still at Pearl Harbor or perhaps scattered across the South Pacific. June 4th, 1942, 4:30 a.m. Japanese carriers launched their first strike against Midway, 108 bombers and fighters. At 5:34 a.m., a PBY Catalina patrol plane spotted the Japanese fleet and radioed. Many planes heading Midway. Minutes later, another contact report. Two carriers and battleships bearing 320, distance 180. The intelligence had been perfect. The Japanese were exactly where Rochefort said they would be. Admiral Fletcher made a crucial decision. He would launch strikes against the Japanese carriers immediately, catching them while their planes were attacking Midway and their decks were most vulnerable. But there was a complication. Reconnaissance reports had only located two carriers. Intelligence suggested there should be four. Where were the others? At 7 o'clock a.m., Fletcher ordered Spruance to proceed southwesterly and attack enemy carriers when definitely located. He would hold Yorktown's aircraft in reserve until all Japanese carriers were found. This decision, to strike immediately with two-thirds of his force while holding one-third in reserve, reflected the balance between aggression and caution that would characterize American decision-making throughout the battle. Meanwhile, Admiral Nagumo faced his own dilemma. His strike on Midway had encountered unexpected resistance. American defenders had been alerted, another intelligence success, and were ready. The strike commander radioed that a second attack would be necessary to suppress Midway's defenses. Nagumo made a fateful decision. He ordered his reserve aircraft, which had been armed with torpedoes for anti-ship attack, to be rearmed with bombs for a second strike on Midway. It was exactly the wrong moment. While Japanese deck crews frantically rearmed aircraft, removing torpedoes and replacing them with bombs, American strike aircraft were approaching. The first American attacks came from Midway-based aircraft and from Hornet's torpedo squadron. Obsolete TBD Devastator torpedo bombers flying low and slow. Japanese fighters and anti-aircraft fire slaughtered them. Of 15 aircraft from Torpedo Squadron 8, only one survived. None scored a hit. But these sacrificial attacks drew Japanese fighters down to wave-top level, leaving the high altitude undefended. At 10:22 a.m., dive bombers from Enterprise and Yorktown arrived overhead. Looking down, they saw Japanese carriers in the worst possible configuration. Decks packed with fully fueled, fully armed aircraft, surrounded by fuel lines and ordnance carts. Lieutenant Commander Wade McCluskey, leading Enterprise's dive bombers, made the attack call. Within minutes, his squadron had struck carriers Akagi and Kaga with multiple bomb hits. Simultaneously, Yorktown's dive bombers hit carrier Soryu. In 5 minutes, 3 Japanese carriers were burning wrecks. The fourth carrier, Huryu, would be located and destroyed later that afternoon. Japan's most experienced carrier pilots, veterans of Pearl Harbor, the Indian Ocean raids, and countless training exercises perished in the flames or went down with their ships. Aircraft that represented years of manufacturing effort were destroyed on the hangar decks. The Battle of Midway was effectively over. Japan would never again threaten American strategic positions in the Pacific. The Battle of Midway is often remembered for the dramatic 5-minute turning point when American dive bombers struck 3 Japanese carriers. But that moment was made possible by intelligence work that began weeks earlier. Every decision that led to American victory flowed from Rochefort's intelligence assessments. The decision to defend Midway rather than the Aleutians or Hawaii. The positioning of carriers northeast of the island. The early warning that allowed Midway's defenses to be alert. Even the timing of American strikes, launched the moment Japanese carriers were spotted because intelligence had predicted their approach route and approximate position. Compare this to Japanese intelligence failures. Yamamoto believed American carriers were at Pearl Harbor when in fact they were lying in ambush. He expected strategic surprise when in reality the Americans knew his operational plan in detail. His reconnaissance failed to detect the most important fact of the entire operation: 3 American carriers at Point Luck. The disparity wasn't just about code breaking. It reflected fundamentally different approaches to intelligence. Station Hypo represented a uniquely American approach, informal, meritocratic, and focused on actionable intelligence. Rochefort's team included reserve officers, enlisted men, and even civilians. What mattered was ability, not rank or credentials. They worked in a basement without windows, often without sleep, driven by the knowledge that their work could change the outcome of the war. Rochefort himself embodied this approach. He ignored military protocol, wearing a bathrobe to work because it was comfortable. He challenged superior officers when he believed they were wrong. He focused relentlessly on the operational question: what does the commander need to know? Japanese naval intelligence, by contrast, was hierarchical and fragmented. Different services didn't share information effectively. Senior officers sometimes disregarded intelligence that contradicted their operational plans. The emphasis was on supporting predetermined strategies rather than questioning assumptions. This cultural difference had strategic consequences. When Rochefort's intelligence suggested the Japanese were planning something big, Nimitz listened and adjusted his dispositions accordingly. When Japanese intelligence failed to detect American carriers, Yamamoto proceeded with his plan unchanged. After the battle, the value of signals intelligence became undeniable. Nimitz would later say that the victory at Midway was primarily due to intelligence, the result of superior intelligence work. Admiral Raymond Spruance, who commanded the Enterprise and Hornet Task Force, credited Rochefort's team with providing the priceless advantage of surprise. But the intelligence victory at Midway also created a problem: how to exploit this advantage without revealing its source. If Japan discovered that JN-25 was compromised, they would change their codes and the intelligence window would close. After Midway, the intelligence war in the Pacific intensified. Station Hypo continued breaking Japanese naval codes, providing intelligence that enabled American submarines to intercept convoys and American forces to anticipate Japanese movements. But the intelligence coup that saved Midway nearly became the victim of its own success. In the weeks after the battle, American newspapers published stories revealing that the United States had advanced knowledge of Japanese plans. The Chicago Tribune ran a particularly damaging article that came close to revealing code-breaking operations. The Japanese read these reports. Their naval staff investigated whether their codes had been compromised. Fortunately for the Allies, Japanese investigators concluded that the intelligence probably came from physical observation rather than code breaking. JN-25 remained in use, and American cryptanalysts continued exploiting it. The intelligence advantage proved decisive again in April 1943, when Station Hypo intercepted and decrypted messages detailing Admiral Yamamoto's inspection tour of forward bases. The information included his exact itinerary, including a flight from Rabaul to Bougainville on April 18th. This presented an extraordinary opportunity and a profound dilemma. Yamamoto was Japan's most respected naval commander, the architect of Pearl Harbor, and the symbol of Japanese naval power. His death would be a tremendous blow to Japanese morale and naval leadership, but killing him would require an operation so precisely targeted that it would surely alert Japan to compromised communications. Admiral Nimitz consulted with Washington. The decision went all the way to President Roosevelt, who authorized the mission. On April 18, 1943, P-38 Lightning fighters intercepted Yamamoto's transport aircraft over Bougainville and shot it down. The admiral died in the jungle. Japan did investigate whether codes were compromised after Yamamoto's death. Again, they concluded the Americans had simply gotten lucky with reconnaissance. JN-25 remained in use. The intelligence advantage built at Midway continued throughout the Pacific War. American submarines used decrypted routing information to position themselves along Japanese convoy routes. American forces anticipated Japanese reinforcement efforts and disrupted them. Fleet movements that should have achieved surprise were instead met by prepared defenses. By 1944, Japan made significant changes to their naval codes, but by then the strategic situation had shifted irreversibly. American industrial production had created overwhelming material superiority. The intelligence advantage that had been decisive in 1942 to 43 became one factor among many in an increasingly one-sided conflict. In the basement of Station Hypo, Commander Joseph Rochefort and his team worked in obscurity throughout the war. They received no public recognition. Secrecy demanded that their work remain unknown. After the war, bureaucratic politics denied Rochefort the recognition his contribution deserved. He was passed over for the Distinguished Service Medal that Nimitz recommended, a victim of inter-service rivalry between naval intelligence factions. Only decades later would historians fully document Station Hypo's crucial role at Midway and throughout the Pacific War. In 1986, long after his death, Rochefort was finally awarded the Distinguished Service Medal. His team members received recognition for their contribution to victory, but the real validation came on June 4, 1942, when three American carriers lay in wait for a Japanese fleet that believed it was achieving surprise. In that moment, every hour of tedious code breaking, every pattern recognized in intercepted traffic, every fragment of intelligence carefully analyzed, all of it paid dividends beyond measure. The Battle of Midway is often described as a turning point in the Pacific War, the moment when Japanese expansion was halted and American counteroffensive became possible. That's accurate but incomplete. More precisely, Midway was an intelligence victory that became a tactical victory that enabled a strategic transformation. Without Rochefort's intelligence, American carriers likely would not have been positioned to ambush the Japanese fleet. Without that ambush, Japan might have captured Midway, inflicted severe losses on American forces, and consolidated a defensive perimeter that would have been far more costly to breach. The intelligence victory at Midway demonstrated that information could be as decisive as firepower. that breaking enemy codes could be as important as building better ships, and that a small team of dedicated specialists working in a basement could change the course of history. In modern military terminology, Midway represents a triumph of intelligence preparation of the battlefield, the systematic collection and analysis of information that enables commanders to make decisions based on knowledge rather than guesswork. But it also represents something more human: trust. Nimitz's trust in Rochefort's assessment, even when other intelligence officers disagreed. Rochefort's trust in his team's ability to extract meaning from fragmentary information. The team's trust that their grueling work mattered. That trust was vindicated on June 4th, 1942, when American dive bombers rolled into their attacks and caught 3 Japanese carriers with their decks full of aircraft. In that moment, intelligence became action. Information became victory. The codebreakers who made it possible watched from their basement, listening to radio traffic as the battle unfolded, knowing that they had given American forces the one advantage that no amount of courage or skill could create on its own: foreknowledge. Admiral Nimitz was right. Midway was primarily an intelligence victory, and in the annals of warfare, it stands as perhaps the finest example of how knowledge, carefully gathered and wisely applied, can overcome superior force. The watchers in the basement had won their battle before the first bomb fell.